This episode of New Politics was released on the 26th of August, 2023, and produced on the land of the Wongal and Whadjuk people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, the well-managed National Labor Conference ends, but not everyone is happy. The Conservative Political Action Group is at it again, and this time they're complaining about kitty litter in girls' toilets. Peter Dutton appears on the kitchen cabinet, the future of the ABC, and media reporting on family members of the Prime Minister. I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis. I bless the rains down in Africa.
And if you'd like to support New Politics, you can support us through a Patreon subscription, and you can also subscribe on Substack. But whether it's a subscription or whether you just want to listen in, read our material online or buy a t-shirt or buy a book, it's all available at newpolitics.com.au, and all of this is a good way to support independent journalism. The National Labor Conference ended last weekend, and it was the first national conference for a Labor government since Julia Gillard was Prime Minister in 2013. And these national conferences have been criticised for some time now for being two-stage managed, for not having too much open discussion, and whatever is open up to discussion ends up being closed down, managed behind closed doors, and everyone goes home behind the veneer of happiness and then wait until the next conference to bring up their grievances. And the idea with this conference is to review the Labor Party platform and give the delegates and members an opportunity to voice their concerns about issues such as AUKUS, nuclear weapons and non-proliferation, treatment of asylum seekers and refugees, tax reform, human rights issues, workers' rights, and pretty much everything else in between. And there has been a bit of nostalgia about when Labor conferences used to have big ideological fights and dramas going on at the conference floor in the 1980s and the 1990s, but even those events were stage managed too, and most of the details were negotiated behind closed doors as well at that time, or even before the conference even commenced. But there would have been a lot of surprises in the 1980s and the 1990s that 40 years later, a Labor Prime Minister will be saying this:
if you're serious about national security, that you then analyse what is the best form of submarines for us to have. And I have come to the position, based upon advice and analysis, that nuclear-powered submarines are what Australia needs in the future.
So that was one big issue from the National Labor Conference, but the bigger issue seems to be this comment from Anthony Albanese.
We seek long-term government because it's the difference of whether we shape the future or the future shapes us. All of this depends, of course, on bringing people with us on the journey, earning and repaying people's trust, delivering meaningful help for Australians, demonstrating our responsible approach on everything from the economy to foreign policy to national security, and showing we are capable of bringing people together in the national interest. Now, this may not always grab every headline. It mightn't suit the agenda of those who prefer protest to progress, who imagine that grand gestures and bold declarations are better than the patient work of ensuring lasting change. But we're not here in the Labor Party for mere gestures. We are here to change the country, to go the distance, to get to the destination, to deliver the better future that we promised.
And that leaves one big question. Is it better to do the things in the shorter period of time, because you just never know how long you're going to be in government for, or play the long game and try and stay in office for as long as possible and see if everything falls into place?
The trouble with the long game, of course, is that that's what the last government tried to do, and they didn't do it very well. And it led, I think, to cynicism in at least parts of the electorate, that the last government was only in it for the perks of government, not the responsibility. I think it's good that they are trying to think beyond the 3-year electoral cycle, which is too short, really. I think 4 years would be probably better. I say that as a resident of New South Wales who's thought that the last few governments in New South Wales have been in too long. But it gives you a chance to put in your policies. It gives you a chance to spend a couple of years bedding down what you set out to achieve, rather than a year of settling in, a year of doing stuff, and then a year of campaigning. That seems to me to be a bit quick. And, of course, it was the Liberal Party who wrecked the chance at 4 years just because they could, thereby shooting themselves in the foot. I think Labor has achieved a lot. Some good, NAC. I don't think there's very many people who are opposed to NAC. The NACC, stabilising relationships with China has been a good thing. Changes to childcare have been good. There's also been some not so good things, but they've done them. They've approved more coal mines. The long and damaging AUKUS is also an achievement. We have to balance the good and the bad. But the point is that it's not as if they've sat down and done nothing, which we can't really say about the last government.
Oh, and I think we also have to point out that all governments want to be long-term governments. There's absolutely nothing wrong with having those ambitions, but the problem ends up being that tiny little issue of an election every 3 years. And if you don't actually achieve that much in your 3-year term, there's no point in saying to the electorate, well, we didn't achieve very much because we were preparing ourselves to be in government for 10 years. And I've always felt that the best way to achieve long-term government is to be a good government. And we could argue that the coalition was a terrible government for most of their time in office, but they ended up getting 9 years anyway. And I think the issue is that politics can change very quickly. And 1 minute you've got control of the agenda and seemingly in ascendancy, and then the next minute all of that pressure is piled up and people want to get rid of you. And that's essentially what happened to the Morrison government. And a lot of critics have recently been saying, well, the Whitlam government managed to get all of these things done very quickly and implemented a lot of reforms. And it could be argued that they were long overdue reforms that should have happened anyway at that time in 1972. But someone had to do it, and it was the Whitlam government that did all of those things at the time. But I think in 2023, and as you mentioned, David, it's not as though the Albanese government has done nothing. It was the National Anti-Corruption Commission. They've stabilised the relationships with China and the Pacific region. They've enacted legislation for 43% emissions reductions by 2030 and net zero by 2050. Those changes to childcare, early education, paid parental leave, aged care, intervention in the energy market to stabilise prices. But then the critics are referring to some of those issues that you mentioned, David, that they've also had more logging, more mining. There's been more AUKUS, more funding for private schools. So they have been a busy government, whether we agree with some of the things or not. But could they have done more? You know, should they be looking at a super profits tax or the reform of the taxation system, more for public housing, education? But are these some of the issues that they could implement in a second term if they actually get there?
It's all about the getting there. And yeah, part of the job of the Prime Minister is not only managing today, it's partly managing yesterday by explaining what you did, but it's also thinking about, well, we've got an election that we have to... How much political capital can we burn? How many scandals can we get away with? How much incompetence will the public put up with? How much good stuff are we able to do to present an electable package for the next election? Now, the rules aren't quite like that in Australia. You can be the biggest bunch of yahoos and yobs and get elected 3 and 4 times in a row, as we've seen with the last government. Labor, of course, has to, and the Greens too, have to present in a professional and competent way 100% of the time. The tiniest infractions are magnified, the biggest achievements are minimised. So it's a little bit different. Till we clear out and clean up the media, that's always going to be the case. It should be the Liberal Party who are lifted rather than the Labor Party who are dropped. Holding governments to account should be the thing we do, rather than balancing one side over the other. All governments should be held to account all the time.
Oh, and as you mentioned, David, there are those different expectations placed upon Labor governments that, well, especially from their membership, that they should be more reformist or more progressive. And that's essentially, as far as I can tell, what the result of the 2022 federal election told us. That after 9 years of Conservative government between 2013 and 2022, and that seems to be inherently the case after a change election, the electorate said, well, we're going to put you in because we didn't like the other guys, go and do your stuff, go and do whatever you have to do. But there still seems to be this reticence about this Labor government. The Liberal National Coalition, when they're in office, it seems like they can do whatever they want according to their ideological plans. They can be as divisive as they like, they can be as racist as they like, as religious as they like, or as offensive, and this is usually lauded and applauded by the mainstream media. But when Labor is in government, they always have to tread more carefully, and they tend to reveal less of their true stuff. And there's always that stuff about, Labor can't manage the finances. They always give favours to their union mates. They support all of these marginal interest groups. And I think because of this commentary, they're almost trying to hide all of these issues or what a true Labor government is so that they remain electable. And I keep wondering about this. Are they afraid of the media? Are they afraid of the electorate? Or is it a combination of the two? Because it always seems that they have to be on tenterhooks or walking on eggshells just in case the winds start blowing in a different direction.
One of the things that I did admire about Paul Keating was his absolute forthrightness. He held the press to account, and that got some better interviews. If you asked him a question that he thought was stupid and pointless, he would tell you so. Now, probably sometimes he used that to get away from difficult things he didn't want to answer, but the good journalists would still be able to reframe the question in such a way that it made it better for him to answer and made for better discussions. I'm not quite sure why our last few Labor governments have been timid. They're going to end up being trashed by the press anyway. You may as well go in swinging. And I think that you get a bit more support from the public for that rather than being timid and getting short-term rewards for long-term damage. Labor should go in and jump, and Labor should listen to its members.
Oh, and just going back to the conference, because that's where we all started with this, and the big criticism has been that the National Labor Conference was stage managed, and I've got news for the media. Every conference has to be stage managed, and you have an agenda list. People take turns to speak, and there's a formal order for questions. And I'm not sure if the media is just expecting the delegates to throw eggs and rotten fruit or have a big brawl on the stage, and that's the impression that they're trying to put out there. But even those Labor conferences of the 1980s and the 1990s, where the media is talking about all of these ideological brawls and arguments that broke out, they were orderly events too. And this goes for the Liberal Party too. Their conferences are stage managed too, and they have their ideological disputes also. But the whole purpose of the National Labor Conference is to make sure that the Labor platform is still relevant for the party of today and for any areas of policy that need to change. And it's quite a large document, and there's a lot of issues that are in there, but a lot of these keep being ignored when Labor is actually in government. Refugee rights and asylum seekers. And sure, they did release the Billawaya family last year from home detention, but that's about it. And a good Labor government, or a good long-term Labor government, would just apply all of the things that are contained within the Labor platform. It's sometimes a bit of a misnomer in the same way as the Liberal Party calls itself a Liberal Party, but it's just a pity that the Labor platform, which is the result of the Labor National Conference, isn't applied more diligently.
It's a shame we don't see a bit more fire. They closed off comments over AUKUS while Richard Marles was going through it on Zoom. It seems to me, as it does to a lot of people, that AUKUS is not supported 100% by Labor Party membership, and probably not even the members of Parliament. And of course, Labor has always had a policy of once it's been voted on, you fall in behind or you get expelled. So I'm not blaming those members who may be opposed for not speaking out. You can often be a better advocate inside the party than from outside the party. But AUKUS is a bad deal, and their embrace of it has left a lot of members angry. They should be mindful of that, because that's where you start to lose members. And political parties are in dire need of members, at least giving people a voice, even if you're not going to let them have their way, I think is a smarter a more effective way of dealing with this than shutting down debate, because debate will open up elsewhere in a place where you may not be able to control its effects as handily, shall we say.
And coincidentally, the Conservative Political Action Group held its conference on the same weekend as the National Labor Conference, and these CPAC events are becoming more frequent in Australia. This is actually an American event, but they've decided that it's not enough to contain this to the United States. It has to be exported to the rest of the world. And they had the usual agenda of climate change denial, extreme libertarianism, racism, and the big campaign against the voice to Parliament. But they had the usual suspects there and the usual nuttery going on. Here's Alan Jones leading the way.
Greta Thunberg told us, and she addressed the United Nations, that we have stolen her dreams. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We're at the beginning of mass extinction. And of course, these are all lies, but they feed into the propaganda that's taught in the classroom. It feeds into the propaganda of kids. So now they think a boy can be a girl, no matter what the biology says. They put kitty litter in girls' toilets because some girls want to be cats. I mean, you can't... Who has opened their mouth on a single sentence about any of this, where we have indoctrination rather than education?
And perhaps nobody's opening up their mouths about it because none of this is actually true, but the biggest issue for them seems to be that right to be offensive and that right to be obnoxious, pushing on all of these issues that no one really seems to care about too much. And CPAC's own material pushes that message that they espouse the best of Howard, Reagan and Thatcher. But it's definitely not the best of those people. John Howard is still around, but Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher would despise these CPAC people if they were still alive. These are despicable people whose only purpose in life is to create division, create conflict, punch down on people and manufacture all of these issues that simply don't exist.
They'd use them for their political advantage, but yes, they would absolutely despise them. They would make sure that they were silenced and kept away, even if they agreed with a lot of what they were saying. The presentations were awful. There was one speaker who got up and said the most awful racist stuff. It was later claimed he was a comedian, and I suspect he was that type of comedian who they all laughed at him when he said he was going to be a comic, but no one's laughing now type thing. Alan Jones, enough said. How Alan Jones, given his well-recorded proclivities, has any following at all by the people whose first default to anyone they don't like is they must be inappropriate to children. How Alan Jones gets any following out of these people is something that will defeat me for a long time. It was sad to watch a dying influence trying to remain relevant, a group of pathetic nobodies trying to be someone, and of course given airtime on our media, it says it all really.
That's the purpose behind the CPAC conference, to give prominence to these sorts of views. But if you have a look at some of the people involved at the CPAC conference, Senator Jacinta Price, she received 3% of the vote at the last federal election. Pauline Hanson received 0.8% of the vote in Queensland. Senator Alex Antich, he received just 0.06% of the vote, or 687 votes out of the 1.1 million votes cast in South Australia. And then there's all the others. Barnaby Joyce, buffoon politician. Tony Abbott, has-been. Bronwyn Bishop, also a has-been. John Anderson, has-been. Warren Mundine, rejected by both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party. Gary Johns, he was actually a former Labor MP many, many years ago. Amanda Stoker, rejected by the voters last year. Then there's the Christian Lobby. Then there's the Institute of Public Affairs. So all of these people, they're fringe dwellers. They're either poorly supported in politics or failed politicians who left politics a long, long time ago. And they're not really represented by many people in the Australian electorate, and they're not representative of the Australian community. And a healthy society does need to accept a broad range of viewpoints, and that's the essence of a democratic system. But these people are so unaccepting of other viewpoints, and I guess, David, you and I are doing the same at the moment in some respect, but these people are hostile. They seem to be very angry about everything in the world. They're racist. They want to humiliate people who disagree with them, and they spread misinformation. So it's a strange brand of conservatism, if that's what it's going to be called. But I think it's a rubbish brand of politics imported from the United States, which I don't think we either need here or anywhere else in the world. But I don't think there's going to be a brand of conservatism that can survive.
It needs a complete rethink. Maybe there are some highly intelligent younger conservatives out there who realise that this way leads to extinction and can come through and be intellectuals and make points that, even if you don't ultimately agree with, makes you stop and think, that is inclusive to everybody, that a breed of conservatism that allows anybody to accept it. This would be much healthier for political discourse in Australia, of course, or anywhere really. But at the moment, we're stuck with Trumpian cult of personality nonsense and simple solutions to complex arguments and the disparagement of knowledge, the disparagement of experts, the disparagement of intellectualism. That's not conservatism. I don't know what it is. It's not something that we should be encouraging. Tony Abbott famously said, "I'm sick of experts." Then where are you getting your advice, Tony? And of course, the reason they don't like experts is that experts show them where they're wrong. Experts are the ones who warned us about COVID. Experts are the ones who warn us about global warming. Experts are the ones who talk to us about constitutional matters. You don't want that because that goes against your worldview. To go back to a somewhat expansive conservatism, people who didn't agree with each other, by the way, but gave something that was always worth reading rather than the unhinged ranting we get now and the anger and the disappointment. And one can't help but feel that it's themselves that they're angry at and that they're disappointed in, because there's no arguments as to why anything else would offend them. This notion that you can say any old thing that you don't approve of, whether it's true or not. The kitty litter in the classroom so children could identify as cats. That to me sounds like some kind of cynical joke that has snowballed into this actually happened. Can't quite tell you where, but it happened and becomes an urban legend of my, postman's best friend's second cousin's aunt knew of a kid who identified as a cat in a primary school in a state that's not this one. And it's all going nuts. It's just sad to watch the intellectual decline of what should be an important discussion, even if we don't agree with it, before we get our leftist friends coming in saying, "Oh, you shouldn't be defending conservatism." Not necessarily the ideas, but certainly the approach. I want good, robust, solid, intelligent political debate in Australia. I don't want to hear Senator Babbitt, Senator Antich, Senator Hanson, Mark Latham, Malcolm Roberts. It's not smart. It's not clever. It's not anything. It's just white noise, I think, used to distract from much smarter thinking.
Maybe that kitty litter story came from that comedian that you referred to before. But that comedian, I've looked him up, his name is Rodney Marks, and he's the go-to comedian for these types of right-wing events. And I'm not going to play the full clip of these offensive racist jokes, but here's a short snippet to give some context.
All weekend I've been here and you've been a great audience. Yeah, but Adolf Hitler also had a great audience. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional rent seekers, past, present, and emerging. But seriously.
And there were a whole lot of other racist jokes and snide comments about historically marginalised people and groups, and that got howls of laughter from the audience. And I was thinking, well, how old are these people to laugh at this sort of material? And maybe I'm just being a bit sensitive about these issues, David, because I used to get the brunt of these types of racist jokes in the playground many, many years ago, but that was a long, long time ago. And I just get the feeling that we've tried to leave this part of Australia behind, the punching down of people, making fun of them, humiliating them, just because they're different in some sort of way, or they look different, or they sound different, or they eat different food. And I thought that this was a part of Australia that we're trying to remove, but it's these people like the ones at CPAC that want all of this old part of Australia to remain. And there have been a few people within the Liberal Party that can see what the problem is. Senator Andrew Bragg and Matt Keane, he's a New South Wales Liberal, they've called this out to say, well, No, this is not what the Liberal Party represents. It's not what the Liberal Party is, but I'm sorry to say half of the Liberal Party was actually at the CPAC conference on the weekend. But it is true. These people are the fringe. These people are not true Liberals. They're not even true Conservatives. They're actually something completely different. And it's not just at the CPAC conference on the weekend. Senator Michaelia Cash also held a Liberal Party rally in Perth, and that was to campaign against the Voice to Parliament and featured prominently on the racist channel of 7 West Media.
Changing our founding document and being stuck with the negative consequences forever? No! No! And do we support dividing our great country on the basis of race? No! Mr. Albanese and the Australian people, if you don't know, vote no! If you don't know, vote no! Once more, if you don't know, vote no!
And there's a lot to unpack here. There's a whole group of people shouting out and proclaiming their ignorance. Now, generally in life, David, I'm a curious kind of guy, and if I don't know about something, I always try to find out. But the ignorance on this level is quite astounding. It's almost like saying, well, we don't even care about First Nations people. We're not even going to bother ourselves with this issue. We don't even know what we're voting about, but we are going to vote no anyway. But it's using a high level of ignorance to achieve a political goal, a high level of racism as well. And I think that's the worst part about this process.
Yeah, they're saying don't know, vote no. I say in doubt, find out. And you can have that yes campaign, pay me when you've won. Or unsure, learn more. In an election campaign, to campaign on ignorance, to me, seems to be the most ridiculous and short-sighted thing. And it smacks of desperation. As that, I'll call them conservative, see that they're losing influence, see that Australia has changed. And it changed in 1788, really. But it also changed in 1972. Changed in 1996. It tried to get back to where they were pre-72, and it couldn't be done. As they say, the genie was out of the bottle. You can't put it back in. It's just sad. This may be the last time we hear from these people as they fade off.
Well, just looking at that rally, I think that might be actually the case. It might be the last time that we hear from some of these people.
Yeah, not just demographically or actuarially, but I don't know how long you can go speaking to no one before people stop paying you any attention.
You're listening to New Politics. You can subscribe to us on Apple or Google Podcasts, listen through Spotify, YouTube, SoundCloud and Amazon Music. Or you can find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can now support New Politics through Substack and Patreon.
There's been a lot of corporate profits floating around at the moment. A few weeks ago, the Commonwealth Bank posted a profit of $10 billion. The Coles supermarket chain posted a profit of $1.1 billion and Woolworths posted a profit of $1.6 billion. And there's been a string of other high profits in big business from this recent reporting period. Qantas just delivered a record $2.5 billion profit. So it looks like all of that poor service from Qantas over the past few years has finally paid off. And this is coming in a time of stagnant wages over the past decade and a time of high costs of living issues. And a healthy corporate sector is the sign of a healthy economy. And these profits do go to shareholders as well, but not everyone owns shares. 51% of the adult population doesn't own shares. But these profits that are happening at the moment, and they are quite extreme, they need to be shared around within the economy. A healthy economy just isn't based around corporate profits. It needs to be based around how that's shared around and how everyone benefits, not just the few. And it seems like there's quite a few people who are missing out here.
It shows that the kleptocracy, or the corporatocracy, if you like, I think the terms are interchangeable, are at one of their periodic peaks. Now would be the time, of course, for a left-leaning Labor government to introduce a super tax to take 20%, still leaving the companies with much more money than they'd ever need. If the companies were actually as philanthropic as they claim to be, wouldn't you spend the next year giving away groceries? Not to just charities as a tax deduction, but here's the shop, take what you need, see you next year because we've done so well. It'll cost us $100 million, but hey, we still have $900 million in the bank. They won't do this, of course. That might affect the share price. It might affect their directors' fees. The next year they could go back and they might not make as much profit, but profit's really the good thing. At the size of Qantas, at the size of Coles, at the size of Woolworths, making any amount of money is a good thing. Making $1 billion is gross and obscene. They should think about how can they make things better for the whole country, not just about themselves.
And high corporate profits at a time when there are cost of living issues and stagnant wages, well, that doesn't sit well with many people in the community. And I think it is clear that more people are starting to make that link between the low wages that have been in existence over the past decade and high corporate profits. But it's just a question of what can be done about it. And although there's a Labor government in office at the moment, the unions have got their lowest workplace representation ever. And Australia's not like the streets of Paris where people will throw Molotov cocktails until they get the pay that they do deserve. And if you've got a largely de-unionised workplace and punitive laws which prevent strike action, it's difficult to see how wages will rise. And the only thing that seems to push wages up is a low unemployment rate, and big business just doesn't like that. But the unions have been calling for a super profit tax, so at least the government can recoup some of this revenue. And they've also questioned whether there's enough competition in the banking sector and supermarkets, because it's a situation that just can't keep going on for too much longer.
No, we've got to reform the tax system in a way that rewards individuals and that doesn't punish big corporations, but allows big corporations wealth, which is made by ordinary citizens using their goods and or services, and redistributes at least some of that back to those who helped them get there. This notion that tax is theft seems to be dying a bit, whether those who like it have realised that it's not popular, whether there is this sense of maybe we should pay tax and be corporately responsible, or maybe it's a mix of the two. Although Jennifer Westacott came out and said, this is the time to lower corporate taxes. No, Jennifer, this is the time to raise them. If corporations weren't doing so well, maybe we could think about it then based on the circumstances. But while the big companies are doing so well, now is the time to share the wealth to a degree. But certainly looking at these profits and saying, yep, we can use some of that money for hospitals, for schools, for law and order, for better infrastructure and all the other things that we need, most of which those big corporations benefit from anyway.
And in the wake of all these large corporate profits, the government has commissioned the ACCC to establish a task force to have a look at competition within key areas of the economy, but this might end up just being a bit of window dressing. And it seems like there's a lot more that has to be done to the economy and make it work more in the interests of the community rather than big business. But there's a lot of economic issues that need to be addressed for the future. And there was the release of the intergenerational report during the week from the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, and that indicates that there are big issues that will reveal themselves over the next 40 years or so, and that mainly relates to an ageing population and smaller population growth. But the other factor to consider is that the economy will be quite different in 40 years' time when compared to today, in the same way that the economy of today is quite different to the economy 40 years ago in 1983. There's been a lot of technological changes. Union membership rates in 1983, 40 years ago, they were 50% of the workforce. Today it's around 12% of the workforce, and who knows what it's going to be like in 2063. But the good thing is that these changes happen slowly enough for governments to implement the legislation that they need to implement, but they have to do them now rather than make the changes when it's too late. And I think that's why Anthony Albanese's rhetoric about preferring long-term government over making the radical changes now is quite frustrating. But it's also a little bit of a conundrum. You probably need a long-term government to make these long-term changes that are in the national interest, but a lot of these issues can't wait for the long term to be implemented.
John Maynard Keynes said, in the long term, we're all dead. So, yeah, again, that conundrum, you're right. That conundrum of how do you play for the long term while keeping everyone happy in the short term plays out. And just to go back, I suppose, too, Labor's looking at the fact that the Liberal Party is in absolute dire straits and there's no real opposition. Although there's nothing in the Constitution stopping a Parliament of Independents, with Labor being the opposition as the majority major party, and then a front bench of independents who aren't aligned to parties. That's a totally possible and I would say even probable outcome over the next few elections. So that's another thing they've got to watch out for.
And there's also a few other issues going on in federal politics. Peter Dutton did appear on the ABC's Kitchen Cabinet during the week, and we've already previously outlined what we think of the idea of journalists meeting politicians at their home, cooking up a meal, flirting with each other and doing the small talk of what makes them tick. It's actually the worst kind of political coverage and political journalism that you could ever come across. And a few people have suggested that we should actually see an episode of Kitchen Cabinet where all the people who have suffered from the policies of the time when Peter Dutton was in government should come in and prepare a meal and let Peter Dutton know what they think about his policies. But this episode was completely predictable. It confirmed that Peter Dutton is quite a one-dimensional political character. He's not a deep thinker, and he probably would be a disaster if he ever did become Prime Minister. But he made a revelation that he's possibly suffering from post-trauma stress disorder, and this is as a result of his work in the Queensland Police Force over 10 years. But if this really is the case, he should be seeking medical help, not in the running for the highest office in the land.
It's a very serious issue, of course, and police officers do suffer from it. I've said before that police see the worst of humanity, the worst acts that could ever be imagined is something that police officers see. And the constant stress, every time you pull a car over, every time you knock on a door, every time you walk into a place of business, you could be shot at. It's not likely in Australia, but it does happen. You could be spat on, abused. You could be assaulted. So for him to claim PTSD, I think is not something that we dismiss lightly. But again, you're absolutely right. If he has it, and even high-functioning PTSD can change very quickly. You can have a total collapse and stop functioning altogether. If he has worked through his issues, good on him, but he shouldn't be claiming it because he doesn't have it anymore. If he hasn't worked through his issues, he needs to step down and work through them. And, I mean, this will sound cynical, but if he was to do that, that would be something that you would hope that he does well out of and comes out the other side a better person and a better functioning person, so that then he might be able to run for the top office in the land. It seemed to me to be a very strange way to go, because the only solutions is that he has it and can function, but is on the knife edge that all PTSD sufferers are on. Or he doesn't have it anymore because he's worked through it, and that's a good thing, or he needs to get it fixed sooner rather than later.
For me, it's just so hard to know what to think about all of this. Yes, post-traumatic stress disorder is a real issue, and it does affect people in the police force, as you mentioned, but I was surprised that it was just such a throwaway line. It's like people when they say, oh, I've got the flu, when all they've got is a bad cold, or when people say, oh, I'm feeling so depressed, when all they've had is just one bad day. Flu and depression are serious illnesses and need to be treated accordingly, and PTSD is a similar sort of situation as well. It has to be medically diagnosed, and people do suffer badly from it. And if Peter Dutton thinks that he's got PTSD, well, go and get treatment for it. Don't go onto Kitchen Cabinet and tell us all about it. Go and see a doctor. And aside from the possibility of this issue, it seems that Peter Dutton's police work, although it ended over 25 years ago in 1998, is highly influencing his decision-making and his ideas about what government is all about. And everything seems to have a law and order solution to it. Asylum seekers, lock them up. African gangs, lock them up too, even though there isn't really much of an issue with African gangs in Melbourne. Indigenous people in Alice Springs, law and order, lock them up too. Social security issues, pensions, let's set up robo-debt, another form of punishment. And Peter Dutton seems to be at war with everyone. It's like being the police commissioner in Queensland. Everything was resolved through brute force and punitive actions, and I don't think you can really be that sort of person if you want to be Prime Minister. And being the leader of the opposition is like a job application for Prime Minister. Well, it actually is a job application for Prime Minister. You give the electorate an idea of what you'll be like if you ever do become Prime Minister. And I can't imagine Peter Dutton, if he ever does become Prime Minister, being any different to the time that he was Home Affairs Minister, or when he was Minister for Defence, or when he was Minister for Immigration, or even going back further when he was in the Queensland Police Force in 1998. And I think for that reason, I just don't think that he'll ever become Prime Minister. You just cannot be a one-dimensional person.
Until really Scott Morrison, every Prime Minister was an interesting person. Even the dud ones were interesting. They were complex, they were multifaceted, they were contradictory, some of them were approaching greatness, others were approaching extreme mediocrity, but there was always an interest about them. Scott Morrison changes this, of course, in that this complete non-entity bully somehow becomes Prime Minister and acts like a complete non-entity bully. I know that the whole point of Kitchen Cabinet was to humanise. That's its grave mistake. It shouldn't be there to humanise. It should be there to ask tough questions. Sure, do it over a meal. That's the gimmick. Okay, that's fine. But instead of laughing about things and reducing things to simple sound bites and lessening the impact of things, it should be saying, okay, well, why did you lock these people up? Why have you chosen this view on The Voice? How do you explain the behaviours of this colleague or that colleague? It should be those types of questions. It'd be nice if you could get what is the intellectual basis of your philosophy and get some deep discussion in. But instead of joking around and, oh, he's a nice guy really, like the Kevin Rudd one wasn't any better. Just light fluff that told us nothing at all about Rudd's approach. Now, okay, I'll be really fair. Rudd had written several substantial essays on stuff explaining exactly where he came from and what his vision was. But you could ask, why did you compromise those visions? Why did you sell out? It's a strange show that I don't think should last much longer, and the crew should be put onto other more worthy projects.
This is New Politics, one of the top 10 Australian politics and news commentary audio programs. You can listen to us on Apple or Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, and you can find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can contribute and support New Politics on Substack and Patreon.
And speaking of the ABC, Aisha Buttrose is going to be stepping down from the ABC, and she's been the chair of the ABC since 2019 and will leave the position in May 2024. And there have been a few people rejoicing at this announcement and expecting to see wholesale changes in the way that the ABC presents news, politics and current affairs from 2024 onwards, but the problems at the ABC go far beyond the chairperson's position. It goes far beyond even the makeup of the current board. The problems essentially began all the way back in 1996 when the Howard government was elected, and from all of those conservative attacks on the ABC over the past 27 years, where the coalition has been in federal office for 20 of those years. And it takes time to change a large organisation, especially a media organisation, but it's also a question of what does the ABC need to change too. And there has been a massive change in the media landscape over the past decade, and there's going to be more changes in the next decade or two. And most of the criticisms that we've come across of the ABC relate to its political coverage, where it seems to be a replica of other commercial outlets. It's favouring conservative interests. It favours the Liberal Party and the National Party. It's more based on clickbait material and sensationalist journalism. It can no longer be trusted, and it no longer provides the quality journalism and coverage that it used to in the past. So the ABC does need to change, but what does it actually change into?
Good journalism, good programming, less overseas stuff, more locally produced stuff. Going back to where both sides complained on how biased it was, which suggested that it was probably getting it about right, because both sides were being held to account. I think allowing more voices, allowing that it's not about ratings per se, but about everybody getting something that they'd be interested in. I think going back to the Charter, it hasn't really followed the Charter very closely over the last few years. This isn't just Ida Buttrose's fault, by the way. She inherited a particular culture that was going to take decades to change. I don't know that she did much to change it, but the next chairperson, and I've heard some very interesting suggestions. Kerry O'Brien, for example, would be a very interesting suggestion. Private broadcasters don't belong in the ABC. We need it to get back to being a high-quality public broadcaster, not a government channel, but shows of interest to everyone in the community. Now, sometimes your show of interest might be on 3 o'clock on a Thursday morning, but that's what I've used for. I think when they make me chair, first thing I do is axe every political show and start them all over again. Insiders Q&A, Kitchen Cabinet, 7:30 report.
Well, you're probably right. There's a whole lot of stuff that needs to change there. And the Albanese government is trying to make some changes to the ABC. Yep. It's just superficial at this stage. They did provide more funding to the ABC and guaranteed fixed 5-year funding, but this is a waste of money unless the ABC does change. And there's also so much that is changing within the media landscape. And as you mentioned, David, I don't think it's a matter of changing the ABC charter. It just needs to be adhered to. And the other issue is that it has become more of a conservative plaything over the past 25 years. It's become a poor replica of a lot of material that you can already find in commercial media. It's news and political coverage has become more of an infotainment model, which again is more or less what you're seeing in commercial media. The 7:30 program has moved from being a news and current affairs program to almost like a movie review show and a daily attack on the Victoria government. Insider seems to be a conservative media talk fest, and to top it off, we have Kitchen Cabinet as a politicians' rehabilitation program. And it really is a question of, as I mentioned before, what does the ABC become? Essentially, it's now a mouthpiece for conservative politics. The average age of its audience is around 70, and that's for free-to-air television and radio. The audience for its website and digital content is lower, but not by much. And back in 2001, the former Labor MP, Barry Jones, he created a direction paper for the Labor Party in opposition, and he positioned the ABC at the centre of intellectual and creative life in Australia. And 20 years later, you know, you can't say that about the ABC. It's hard to know what the ABC will look like in 5 or 10 years. It's been a directionless organisation over the past decade or so, and it's also had a lot of political interference during that time. So it will take a while to undo that damage inflicted upon it by the coalition over the past 25 years.
The other thing that's been the unspoken thing of the Liberal government is that they really wanted to sell it off. They didn't quite have the political capital to do that, but the privatisation of the ABC, because it somehow gives competition to commercial networks, even though it operates in a different broadcasting zone, as in what it does is not what the commercial networks do. It's time that the adults in charge started acting like adults in charge when it came to the ABC, and keep that turning of the ship going so it goes back to what it should be. Not what they want it to be, not what it is, but what it should be.
And there were also more revelations from the Australian Financial Review that the son of Anthony Albanese, Nathan Albanese, had an internship with PwC during the time Anthony Albanese was the leader of the opposition in 2021. And it's been claimed that this was organised by Albanese and the head of government relations at PwC, Sean Gregory. And this follows on from the report several weeks ago that Nathan Albanese had received a Qantas VIP pass to the Chairman's Lounge from Alan Joyce. And we discussed this on New Politics several weeks ago, and we've been criticised for not calling this out strongly enough. And I think for public perceptions and confidence in the political system, there needs to be strong rules about the families of members of politicians, especially for the Prime Minister. But this is not like a Hunter Biden type of situation in the US. And I'm not sure what people are expecting us to say. You know, should we be calling for his execution or for 10 years in jail or something like that? And we've said this before, it would have been better if the Qantas VIP pass had been declined, especially in the context of Qantas receiving billions in government support during COVID and protection from competition in key flight routes within Australia. And this has now become a political distraction which could have been avoided. And remembering that every small issue when it comes to the Labor Party is explored, amplified and magnified out of all proportion, and issues when they affect the Liberal Party are often overlooked and forgotten about. And that's the issue that I have here. There needs to be consistency along political lines and the way that these issues are reported in the media. And the Financial Review, they've had quite a field day in reporting this over the past couple of weeks, and it's been incessant, but they were very quiet about a $60,000 scholarship given to the daughter of Tony Abbott in 2013. They were very quiet about a job that was given to the 25-year-old daughter of Barnaby Joyce as a senior advisor to a National Party MP, and that was actually widely reported in independent media, but not so much in the mainstream media. And they were also very quiet when Vicky Campion ended up getting a senior communications position while she was having a relationship with Barnaby Joyce. And they were very quiet about the wife of Warren Ench receiving a $214,000 government grant. So if the media is going to report on these matters, it should report across the board, not just the issues that they feel is going to give them political leverage, especially from a news outlet that has got very strong Liberal Party links.
Certainly, in retrospect, at the time it shouldn't have happened, and I don't condone it at all. I don't think it was done as a quid pro quo. From what I can tell, it was done, my son needs to do some work experience. So you ring up the chair of a company as leader of the opposition, you say, can you fit him in for 2 weeks? And the company says, sure, no problem. It's all done, all very nice. It's over. It's not a good look. Will the now Prime Minister have the opportunity to lighten or lessen some of the consequences that may come from the various inquiries that are going on about PwC's behaviour? Probably not, actually, because it's a Senate inquiry and the Senate's not exactly 100% behind the Prime Minister. But if it does turn out that the Senate finds that it's a lesser thing that everybody's expecting, there'll be people who will point to, well, look at that, Nathan Albanese got 2 weeks' work. Here's the payback. Seems to me to be the worst deal in history too. But politics isn't really about what is or isn't. It's about what is perceived to be or to not be. And so it's the type of thing where it shouldn't have happened. And I know it's hard being a Prime Minister's son or daughter. You need to work twice as hard to get half as much, because people don't necessarily, they either want advantage that your parent can give or they take you on very cynically. And so it is hard.
Oh, well, our children don't seem to have any problems with our fame, David.
No comment. It's a storm in a teacup. I guess the main thing is that if this is a pattern of behaviour where Nathan Albanese and other family members start to get advantages that may or may not be denied to other people, but are perceived to be denied to other people, that this will become problematic. I know I'm going to get hammered by some of our friends on the left. Hello to all of you. Please make your feelings known. You know I enjoy it. But for me, it's a watch and see situation. If it happens again, we see that there's a very problematic pattern here. Remember, this happened a few years back before the Prime Minister was the Prime Minister, and it was for 2 weeks. It was the type of thing that others maybe could have organised, but it's not like Frances Abbott and her $60,000 scholarship that didn't exist before or since, or the other daughter with her BMW employment leading to BMW getting the Comcar in New South Wales. That may have been something that they may have been able to pull off without their father being the Prime Minister at the time. But
well, I think there needs to be a consistency about all of this, and maybe there needs to be a blanket rule about no government involvement for families at all. And I don't know how you'd police that or make it fair to the children of politicians, but whatever the case is, if there's going to be any media spotlight on this, well, it should compare like for like. And Nathan Albanese is being pilloried for being granted a Qantas Chairman's Lounge pass, and that was actually declared on Anthony Albanese's parliamentary register, and a 2-week unpaid internship at PwC. Well, none of this cost the government of the day any money at all, and there was no impropriety as well. But hey, here's a big story here. But those things that cost taxpayers buckets of money, real corruption or real scandal within the Liberal Party and within the National Party, well, let's ignore that because it just doesn't matter. And aside from the unbalanced media coverage, it is time for the federal government to clamp down on that relationship between government activity and family members. There is a clear point that you can't really have these small perks for family members of politicians, irrespective of what they are, and it doesn't matter how innocuous it seems, because corruption in government always starts from the smaller issues. And it's best to make it clear that there are no external influences on government decision-making and that there's no favouritism for family members. And I think that's an issue that needs to be cleaned up quite dramatically.
And again, it's down to Labor to act better, but in this case I think there's no choice, but they have to act better. There's got to be guidelines, because it's not fair on the, your father happens to be Prime Minister, should that stop you getting things that you may be qualified for? So there's got to be some kind of guidelines. The whole Qantas Chairman's Lounge thing is turned into a bit of comedy in that there's all but 3 members of Parliament are members of the Qantas Chairman's Lounge. I think Max Chandler Mather is one who knocked back the invitation. Jackie Lambie, who was kicked out of the Chairman's Club for some kind of behaviour, her invitation was revoked, apparently, allegedly, etc. It's about transparency, it's about communication, it's about making sure that people get the opportunities that they are entitled to get. Like, you'd hate a Prime Minister's child to not get a scholarship, say, to a university that they had applied for, had shown to be appropriate for, and had won fairly. But because of something well out of their control, their parents, who their parents are, they couldn't get that scholarship. And you can see this going to the nth degree. Does the Prime Minister's child not get into the national sports team, even though they're the best player, because they're the Prime Minister's son or daughter? So, without defending anybody, without excusing anybody, I think we've got to think through how do we do this so that it works in some kind of way for everybody.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.